The initial encounters between American aviators and Japanese Zero fighter planes over the vast expanse of the Pacific in the early months of 1942 yielded narratives so astonishing they verged on the fantastical. Yet their implications were grimly real. Pilots recounted tales of an adversary aircraft that possessed an unparalleled agility, capable of executing maneuvers that far surpassed the capabilities of any fighter then fielded by the United States Navy or Army Air Forces. The Mitsubishi A6MO, commonly known as the Zero, was not merely formidable, it was overwhelmingly superior, a fact underscored by the mounting casualties among American aircrews. On February 20, 1942, during the inaugural Japanese aerial assault on Darwin, Australia, a formation of 9 Zeros, tasked with escorting bombers, engaged a hastily launched squadron of P-40 Warhawks. The aerial skirmish was brief, lasting but a few harrowing minutes. In this engagement, the Zeros decimated 4 P-40s without suffering a single loss. The American pilots fortunate enough to survive consistently reported the same disheartening phenomenon. Every attempt to engage a Zero in a turning contest, to align their weaponry for a shot, resulted in the Japanese fighter effortlessly tightening its turn, slipping inside their radius, and ultimately gaining a decisive position on their tail. The experience was akin to attempting a graceful ballet while encumbered by lead weights. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. The statistical data from these nascent months painted a stark and brutal picture. Across the battlefields of the Philippines, over the strategically vital Wake Island, and throughout the sprawling Dutch East Indies, American fighter pilots confronted an inescapable mathematical disparity. The Zero could execute a complete 360-degree turn in approximately 16 seconds at combat speeds. In stark contrast, the F-4F Wildcat, the primary carrier-borne fighter of the American fleet, required roughly 19 seconds for the same maneuver. The P-40 Warhawk demanded an even greater duration. A mere 3-second difference might appear negligible, yet in the context of a turning dogfight, those precious seconds were the margin between life and death. They meant the Zero could complete its turn, achieve a firing solution, and unleash a torrent of 20mm cannon fire into an American cockpit, while the opposing pilot was still laboriously maneuvering their aircraft, futilely attempting to bring their nose to bear on an empty patch of sky. However, raw numerical data only partially illuminates the full scope of the narrative. The Zero's extraordinary turning prowess was the direct consequence of a radical engineering philosophy. Japanese designers conceived an aircraft that, when empty, weighed a mere 5,300 pounds, approximately 2/3 the mass of an F-4F Wildcat. This remarkable weight reduction was achieved through the drastic elimination of almost all protective armor for the pilot and fuel tanks. Self-sealing fuel tanks were absent, and armored plating behind the pilot's seat was minimal. The Zero was, in essence, a potent engine encased in a fragile shell, a deliberate trade-off of survivability for unparalleled maneuverability. American pilots at this early stage were unaware of these design specifics, but they acutely felt the devastating repercussions. Virtually every engagement unfolded with a predictable, disheartening regularity. American pilots would detect Zeros, initiate a diving attack, perhaps unleash a brief burst of gunfire, and then the Zeros would pivot to engage. The moment an American pilot attempted to engage in a turning fight, to maneuver their aircraft in a horizontal circular pattern to track the enemy, they were irrevocably compromised. The Zero would invariably outturn them, seamlessly transitioning from a defensive posture to an offensive one in a matter of seconds. Seasoned pilots developed a profound sense of dread in their stomachs as they pulled back on the stick, acutely aware that they were committing to an aerial contest they were destined to lose. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, in March 1942, following a series of engagements near Guadalcanal, articulated the gravity of the situation. "It's not that our boys lack courage or skill. They have both in abundance, but they're trying to fight by the rules. And the rules don't work anymore. We're teaching them to dogfight, to turn and burn, to stay in the fight against Zeros. That's teaching them to die." His candid assessment pierced to the very core of the crisis engulfing American naval aviation. The entire established doctrine of fighter combat, meticulously refined over years of rigorous training and theoretical development, had been rendered obsolete within a mere span of weeks. The ramifications of this crisis extended far beyond the individual survival of pilots. The crucial objective of air superiority in the Pacific hinged upon prevailing in these fighter versus fighter confrontations. If American fighter aircraft proved incapable of safeguarding dive bombers and torpedo planes, then carrier task forces would be rendered ineffective in striking Japanese targets. Conversely, if fighters could not adequately protect land bases and bomber formations, America's offensive capabilities would simply vanish. The zero problem was not merely a challenge in dogfighting. It imperiled the entire strategic framework of the Pacific theater. Pilots began to refer to it as zero fever, a chilling moment of clarity in a turning fight with a Japanese adversary, when the terrifying realization dawned that the enemy would complete their turn before you. Some pilots, overwhelmed, froze in midair. Others executed desperate maneuvers that only exacerbated their perilous situation. A discerning few, however, began to perceive the situation differently, and these few started to notice subtle yet significant patterns in the Zero's behavior. Commander John Smith Thatch, universally known as Jimmy, grappled with a persistent problem that robbed him of sleep aboard the USS Lexington in early 1942. As the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, he bore the profound responsibility of preserving the lives of his pilots as they confronted an enemy aircraft that demonstrably surpassed their Wildcats in virtually every quantifiable metric. Thatch was an unconventional naval officer for his era. He was not content merely to fly. He dedicated himself to rigorous study. While many of his fellow squadron commanders focused predominantly on gunnery practice and precision formation flying, Thatch invested countless hours meticulously analyzing after-action reports, debriefing returning pilots with painstaking detail, and performing intricate calculations on rudimentary scratch paper. By April 1942, Thatch had amassed sufficient data to discern the emerging pattern with undeniable clarity. American pilots who managed to survive encounters with Zeros consistently shared similar experiences. They described how the Zero pilot would tenaciously lock onto a target and pursue it through a turning engagement with an almost preternatural precision. The Japanese pilot, secure in the knowledge that his aircraft could outturn any American counterpart, would commit fully to the turn, relentlessly tightening his radius, willingly enduring higher G-forces, confident that his prey would inevitably exhaust its turning performance first. This unwavering confidence, Thatch realized, had become a predictable element in their tactics. And predictability, he understood, could be shrewdly exploited. Thatch also noted another recurring detail in the debriefings that most other officers summarily dismissed as mere combat stress or confused recollection. Multiple pilots reported that when they had attempted radical, unexpected maneuvers, sudden precipitous dives, abrupt climbs, or aggressive reductions in throttle, Zero pilots occasionally appeared momentarily surprised. The Japanese flyers had grown accustomed to American pilots engaging in a particular, predictable manner, maintaining speed, attempting to turn, and ultimately succumbing. Any deviation from this established pattern seemed to momentarily disorient the enemy. These were fleeting moments, typically insufficient to save a pilot's life, but they were moments nonetheless. The pivotal breakthrough arrived when Thatch conducted an interview with Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare following his extraordinary performance on February 20th, 1942. O'Hare had, single-handedly, defended the Lexington against an assault by 9 Japanese bombers, successfully shooting down 5. However, what captivated Thatch's attention was not the bombers themselves, but rather O'Hare's innovative approach to neutralizing the escorting Zeros. O'Hare recounted employing high-speed slashing attacks, delivering a burst of fire, and then steadfastly refusing to engage in a turning fight. Instead, he exploited his Wildcat's superior diving speed to disengage, zoom back to a higher altitude, leveraging that speed as kinetic energy, and then initiate another attack. He never permitted a Zero to draw him into a protracted turning engagement. Thatch commenced conducting tactical experiments using ordinary matchsticks on his desk. He would manipulate 2 matchsticks, simulating various tactical approaches. The core problem was one of isolation. If a Zero gained a position on your tail and you lacked the ability to outturn it, your fate was sealed. But what if one were not alone? What if a wingman could be transformed into a weapon? He began to move the matchsticks in crossing patterns, meticulously creating scenarios where a Zero relentlessly pursuing one Wildcat would inevitably fly directly into the firing arc of another. The underlying geometry was elegantly simple, yet its successful execution demanded impeccable coordination and an absolute, unshakable trust between pilots. On May 10, 1942, Thatch assembled his squadron pilots in the Lexington's ready room and elucidated the groundbreaking concept he had meticulously developed. He christened it the beam defense position, although it would forever be enshrined in aviation history as the Thatch weave. The underlying concept was nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of engaging individually, 2 Wildcats would fly parallel courses, maintaining a distance of approximately 200 feet between them. When a Zero initiated an attack on one of the planes, both Wildcats would simultaneously turn toward each other in a synchronized crisscross pattern. The Zero, having committed to pursuing the initial Wildcat through its turn, would suddenly find the second Wildcat crossing directly in front of its nose, guns blazing. If the Zero pilot broke off the attack to avoid being shot, the first Wildcat was safely disengaged. Conversely, if the Zero persisted in its pursuit, it would fly directly into a devastating hail of .950 caliber bullets. However, Thatch was developing far more than just this innovative weave. He was meticulously documenting something even more fundamental about Zero tactics. Japanese pilots, he observed, had fallen into predictable patterns of engagement, patterns predicated on the inherent superiority of their aircraft. They anticipated American pilots to fight in specific, conventional ways, to turn to attempt a dogfight to adhere to rules that inherently favored the zero. This ingrained expectation, Thatch realized, created a form of tactical tunnel vision. Zero pilots would commit to pursuits with such unwavering confidence that they would often disregard crucial warning signs. They would follow American fighters into situations that a more cautious or less arrogant pilot would readily recognize as meticulously laid traps. Thatch diligently shared his profound observations with every squadron commander who would lend an ear. He meticulously drafted detailed tactical memos that circulated throughout the fleet. Some of his groundbreaking ideas were initially dismissed. Senior officers who had never personally confronted a Zero believed Thatch was needlessly overcomplicating what they perceived as simple fighter tactics. Yet, the pilots who had endured the crucible of combat in the South Pacific devoured Thatch's reports like sacred scripture. Here was an individual who truly comprehended the existential threat they faced and who was systematically devising concrete solutions rather than merely demanding greater courage or improved gunnery skills. The ultimate proving ground for these revolutionary tactics would soon arrive at Midway. I am from the United States, and I find the video topic incredibly compelling. It highlights the ingenuity and adaptability required in wartime, especially when facing a technologically superior enemy. The shift from individual heroics to coordinated tactics, like the Thatch Weave, is a fascinating example of how strategic thinking can overcome material disadvantages. It underscores the human element in warfare, the importance of observation, analysis, and trust among comrades. The ultimate examination of a radical new aerial combat tactic was destined to unfold at Midway. The innovative Thatch Weave, on its initial conceptualization, struck many as entirely illogical. For decades, since the conclusion of World War I, established naval aviation doctrine had rigorously championed the sanctity of formation integrity, the power of mutual support through defensive circular maneuvers, and the cultivation of individual dogfighting excellence. Yet, here was Lieutenant Commander Thatch, instructing his fighter pilots to intentionally pivot towards the enemy, to deliberately intersect their wingmen's flight paths at breathtaking speeds, and to place their faith not in the inherent turning superiority of their aircraft, but in the precise interplay of geometry and timing for their very survival. This audacious proposition fundamentally contravened every deeply ingrained instinct that had been painstakingly developed by generations of fighter pilots. During the arduous sea voyage to Midway in late May 1942, Thatch subjected his pilots to an unrelenting regimen of drills. Two Wildcats would repeatedly launch, meticulously practicing the intricate scissoring motion, executing a turn towards each other, swiftly passing, then reversing direction to turn back and pass once more. This repetitive pattern meticulously crafted an interlocking defensive zone, a formidable barrier that a solitary attacker found nearly impossible to breach. However, its effectiveness hinged upon absolute, unyielding precision. A timing discrepancy of even a single second could lead to a catastrophic mid-air collision between the two Wildcats. Any hesitation or misjudgment of the critical crossing point by one pilot would instantly unravel the weave, rendering both aircraft perilously vulnerable. Thatch's pilots continued their rigorous practice until the complex maneuver became an ingrained, instinctive response, enabling them to execute it flawlessly, even amidst the chaos of combat, with adrenaline surging and hands trembling. On the fateful morning of June 4, 1942, The Battle of Midway presented the definitive proving ground for this revolutionary tactic. Thatch, at the head of his division of 6 Wildcats, provided critical escort for torpedo bombers launching their assault on the formidable Japanese carrier fleet. At precisely 09:20 hours, the sky erupted as Zeros swarmed the formation. Thatch witnessed his gravest apprehension manifesting before his eyes. More than a dozen highly agile Zeros diving relentlessly on his numerically disadvantaged Wildcats. Without a moment's hesitation, he immediately initiated the Thatch weave alongside his wingman, Ensign Robert Ramdib. A Zero swiftly latched onto Thatch's tail, predictably following him into the turn with aggressive determination. The Japanese pilot, as Thatch had presciently theorized, was flying with unwavering commitment to the pursuit, supremely confident in his aircraft's superior turning capabilities, and singularly focused on the target directly in his sights. We hope you are enjoying this detailed account of aerial combat innovation. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video for more insights into the evolution of fighter tactics. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Also, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you are from and what you think about the fascinating topic of air combat strategy. Ensign Dib then executed a critical maneuver, crossing directly in front of Thatch at an astonishing combined closing speed of nearly 500 Mach. The pursuing Zero pilot suddenly found himself staring directly down the barrels of Dib's gun sight with less than 2 precious seconds to react. Dib's formidable battery of 650 caliber machine guns unleashed a devastating torrent of fire, utterly shredding the Zero's lightly armored airframe. The Japanese aircraft disintegrated in midair. Thatch, with seamless coordination, instantly reversed his turn, weaving back across Dib's flight path. Another Zero, which had been aggressively pursuing Dib, now encountered the identical geometric dilemma. Thatch's guns were aimed squarely at him. The Zero pilot, unwilling to fly into certain death, abruptly broke off his attack in a blistering display of tactical brilliance spanning less than 30 seconds. The Thatch weave had successfully destroyed one Zero and compelled another to disengage. The intense aerial engagement persisted for nearly 20 minutes. Thatch's division maintained their relentless weaving, their constant crossing, and their unwavering commitment to turning towards each other, rather than attempting to evade independently. The Zeros, accustomed to the relatively easy task of isolating and picking off individual American fighters, found themselves utterly incapable of cracking the impenetrable defensive formation. Every time a Zero committed to an attack run, its pilot inevitably flew directly into a lethal crossfire. Japanese pilots who had grown dangerously comfortable with the predictable tactics of their American adversaries were suddenly confronted with something entirely novel and disorienting. Some displayed commendable adaptability and wisely broke off their attacks. Others, rigidly adhering to their aggressive attack mindset, pressed forward with fatal consequences. By the time Thatch's division returned to the USS Yorktown, they had achieved 3 confirmed Zero kills and had successfully driven off at least 5 additional enemy aircraft. More significantly, they had effectively shielded the torpedo bombers for a sufficient duration to allow their attack to develop, even though the torpedo assault itself ultimately proved largely ineffective due to a confluence of other tactical challenges. Within mere days, news of the Thatch weave's astonishing success permeated throughout the entire Pacific Fleet. Pilots who had previously felt utterly helpless against the superior maneuverability of the Zeros now possessed a tangible, effective defensive tactic that demonstrably worked. However, the WWII represented something far more profound than merely a clever maneuver. It fundamentally revolutionized how American pilots conceived of fighter combat. The antiquated doctrine had placed paramount emphasis on individual pilot skill and the inherent performance characteristics of the aircraft. The emergent new doctrine, however, underscored the critical importance of cohesive teamwork, rigorous tactical discipline, and the astute exploitation of enemy psychology. It became evident that one did not need to outturn a Zero if one could effectively outthink the Zero pilot. Fighter squadrons across the vast expanse of the Pacific theater swiftly began adapting the Thatch weave to suit their specific operational requirements. Some variations incorporated 4 aircraft instead of the original 2, thereby creating even more intricate and complex crossing patterns. Other units meticulously modified the timing and spacing of the maneuver based on whether they were flying the sturdy Wildcats, the versatile P-40s, or the newly introduced and highly anticipated P-38 Lightnings that were just beginning to arrive in the theater of operations. Despite these adaptations, the core principle remained steadfast and unwavering. Always turn towards your wingman, thereby forcing the enemy to make a perilous choice between breaking off their attack or flying directly into a concentrated hail of gunfire. And, crucially, never engage in combat in the manner the enemy anticipates. The psychological ramifications for Japanese pilots were undeniably profound. Intelligence reports gleaned from captured documents and interrogated prisoners of war vividly revealed that Zero pilots had begun approaching combat engagements with significantly increased caution by late 1942. The era of effortless victories that had characterized early 1942 was unequivocally over. American formations that executed the weaving and scissoring maneuvers presented a danger that transcended simple numerical odds. The Japanese tactical advantage, their aircraft's unparalleled maneuverability, had been effectively neutralized, not through superior engineering or technological advancements, but through a triumph of innovative thinking and strategic ingenuity. While Thatch's ingenious weave provided an effective solution for what to do when a Zero managed to gain a position on one's tail, it did not fully address a more fundamental and persistently nagging question for American fighter pilots. How does one proactively engage an enemy that cannot be outturned without first waiting to be attacked? The groundbreaking answer to this critical dilemma emerged from an unexpected quarter from pilots who had managed to survive by completely refusing to engage in traditional dogfighting. These resourceful aviators had inadvertently stumbled upon a revolutionary concept that would soon become the very cornerstone of American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war: energy fighting. Major John L. Smith of Marine Fighting Squadron 223 arrived at Guadalcanal's embattled Henderson Field in August 1942, bringing with him a remarkably simple yet profoundly effective philosophy that he relentlessly instilled into every pilot under his command. Altitude is life, speed is life, turning is death. Smith had undertaken an obsessive and meticulous study of the early combat reports and had arrived at a conclusion that, to traditionally minded fighter pilots, seemed almost cowardly. Under no circumstances should one ever attempt to turn with a Zero. Instead, his pilots were instructed to leverage the singular advantages their aircraft actually possessed: superior diving speed and robust structural strength. The underlying physics of this approach were remarkably straightforward. A Wildcat, when fully loaded, weighed approximately 7,900 late B, significantly more than the Zero's 5,300 LSB. In level flight, assuming identical speeds, both aircraft possess the same kinetic energy. However, in a dive, the heavier Wildcat accelerated at a much faster rate and could achieve considerably higher speeds before encountering its structural limitations. Conversely, the Zero's lightweight construction, the very characteristic that endowed it with such magnificent turning capabilities, became a critical liability in vertical maneuvers. Zero pilots who dove too aggressively risked severely overstressing their airframes. American pilots flying Wildcats, P-40s, and particularly the exceptionally rugged P-47 Thunderbolts that arrived later in the conflict, could execute dives at speeds that would literally tear a Zero apart. Smith's pilots perfected and executed what became famously known as boom and zoom attacks. Their strategy involved patrolling at consistently high altitudes, typically 20,000 FT or even higher, thereby maintaining what pilots referred to as an energy advantage. Upon spotting Zeros below them, they would initiate a lightning-fast high-speed dive, unleash a swift, concentrated burst of fire at their target, and then immediately utilize their accumulated diving speed to zoom back up to their superior altitude before the Zeros could effectively react or pursue. Each attack lasted mere seconds. If the burst connected, the Zero was typically destroyed. If it missed, the American pilot did not linger to assess the damage. He simply converted his speed back into altitude and repositioned for another attack run. The Zeros below could turn and twist and maneuver all they desired. They simply could not catch an aircraft that steadfastly refused to engage them in their preferred arena. Captain Joe Foss, who would ultimately conclude the war as one of America's most celebrated aces with an incredible 26 victories, articulated the core tenets of the energy fighting doctrine in remarkably blunt terms during a debriefing in November 1942. The Zero wants you to turn. That's his game. So don't play it. Stay above him. Stay fast. Hit him when he's not looking, and get out before he can respond. It's not about being brave or proving you're a better pilot in a fair fight. It's about killing the enemy and going home alive. Foss's concise and forceful words perfectly encapsulated the fundamental mindset shift that was rapidly unfolding across the entire Pacific theater. The concept of energy management extended far beyond the simple mechanics of diving and climbing. Pilots were taught to perceive their aircraft as a dynamic reservoir of energy, existing in two interconnected forms: kinetic energy derived from speed and potential energy derived from altitude. Every single maneuver, whether a turn, a climb, or a dive, either expended this energy or traded one form for another. A sharp, aggressive turn, for instance, rapidly bled off speed, converting kinetic energy into angular momentum, and through the resistance of the air, into wasted heat. A climb traded kinetic energy for potential energy, while a dive performed the exact reverse. The overarching goal was to consistently maintain a higher total energy state than your opponent, a strategic advantage that inherently granted you control over the terms of engagement. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had previously voiced considerable lament over the inadequacy of traditional dogfighting tactics, emerged as one of the most fervent and vocal advocates for energy fighting. By September 1942, he had meticulously developed a comprehensive training program that ingeniously utilized chalk talks and blackboard diagrams to teach pilots how to intuitively visualize and understand energy states during the intense dynamics of combat. He would often draw two aircraft on the blackboard and pose a hypothetical scenario. This zero is at 15,000 FT doing 180 knots. You're at 20,000 FPF doing 250 knots. Who has the energy advantage? The unequivocal answer always was the aircraft possessing more total energy, and that aircraft, by virtue of its superior energy state, held the decisive prerogative to either initiate combat or to disengage and flee. The pivotal decision of whether to engage or withdraw demanded a level of self-control that directly contradicted the innate, aggressive impulses of every fighter pilot. When an aviator, having plunged on a zero, found their initial attack unsuccessful, an overwhelming primal urge compelled them to arc around for another attempt. They had just plummeted 5,000 feet at an astonishing velocity, their adversary still seemingly within grasp, and the natural inclination was to immediately re-engage. However, such an abrupt turn would catastrophically dissipate all accumulated speed. Instantly, the pilot would find themselves in the same compromised energy state as the zero, slow, vulnerable, and a prime target. The zero pilot, who moments prior had been defensively evading, could then dramatically reverse the engagement. Those pilots unable to resist this potent yet fatal temptation invariably paid the ultimate price. The ingenious throttle-down overshoot technique emerged not from planned strategy, but from the crucible of desperate aerial encounters where all other tactical options had been exhausted. This was a scenario where the crucial altitude advantage had been surrendered. An enemy zero had skillfully latched onto the tail despite every defensive maneuver, and the protective thatch weave was unattainable because the wingman was embroiled in their own separate, intense struggle. While established energy fighting doctrine unequivocally stated that a pilot should never find themselves in such a precarious position, the unbridled pandemonium of combat often dictates that theoretical principles collide with grim reality in the most unforgiving manner. It was in these dire circumstances that intrepid aviators serendipitously discovered that the very throttle lever itself could be transformed into a potent weapon. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from, what you think about the video topic Ensign James Sweat, quite by chance, stumbled upon this groundbreaking technique on April 7, 1943, amidst a colossal Japanese air raid descending upon Guadalcanal. A tenacious zero had glued itself to his tail after Sweat had expended his critical altitude and speed advantages during a frantic, high-stakes engagement with enemy dive bombers. Sweat was violently wrestling his Wildcat through a series of desperate maneuvers. But the skillful zero pilot mirrored every turn, inexorably drawing nearer, tightening the noose. Sweat's aircraft was already gravely compromised, steadily losing hydraulic fluid, and he was acutely aware that he had perhaps 30 seconds before the Zero's devastating 20mm cannons shredded his empennage. In a moment of pure desperation, he executed an action that defied every ingrained instinct. He abruptly chopped his throttle to idle. The effect was immediate and profoundly dramatic. The Wildcat's precipitous deceleration violently pitched Sweat forward against the restraint of his shoulder harness. Behind him, the pursuing Zero pilot had been meticulously tracking his target's speed, making precise throttle adjustments to maintain an optimal firing position. When Sweat's aircraft unexpectedly decelerated, the Zero's unyielding momentum carried it forward. In the lexicon of aerial combat, this phenomenon is termed an overshoot. The Zero streaked past Sweat's left wing, undergoing a momentous reversal of roles, instantly transforming from predator to prey. Sweat, seizing the fleeting opportunity, slammed his throttle forward, slightly elevated his nose, and unleashed a devastating 2-second volley into the Zero's exposed belly as it hung momentarily in front of him. The Japanese aircraft rolled inverted and plunged into the churning sea below. The fundamental physics underpinning the throttle-down overshoot are deeply rooted in the principles of momentum and the inherent limitations of human reaction time. An aircraft hurtling through the air at 280 miles per hour traverses approximately 410 feet every second. When a pursuing pilot observes their target's speed diminish suddenly, a critical sequence of events unfolds. Initially, there is a recognition lag. The human brain typically requires roughly half a second to fully register that the target's velocity has changed. This is followed by a decision lag, another quarter of a second needed to formulate an appropriate response. Finally, an action lag accounts for the physical time required to move a hand to the throttle or control stick. By the time the pursuing pilot has successfully reduced power and applied the necessary back pressure to prevent an overshoot, they have already unwittingly advanced an additional 200 to 300 feet closer than originally intended. However, the effective implementation of this technique was far more nuanced and sophisticated than a mere simplistic reduction of throttle and a hopeful prayer. Pilots who survived to refine this critical method discovered that impeccable timing and acute situational awareness were absolutely paramount. One could not reduce throttle prematurely, as the pursuing pilot would simply have ample time to adjust their own speed, maintaining their advantageous firing position. Conversely, reducing throttle too late was equally fatal. If the adversary was already within effective firing range, the maneuver would only serve to present an easier target. The crucial juncture, the sweet spot, occurred when the pursuing aircraft was approximately 2 to 3 seconds from its optimal firing position, close enough that the pilot was fixated on their gun sight and target tracking, rather than engaged in gross maneuvering. Mastering this technique also necessitated a profound understanding of the pursuer's tactical mindset. By mid-1943, Zero pilots had developed highly specific attack patterns, honed over hundreds of successful engagements. Their standard procedure involved closing to within 200 feet, settling into a position slightly behind and below their target, and then unleashing a methodical burst aimed directly at the cockpit and engine. This consistent and predictable attack profile made it eminently exploitable. A Zero pilot who had positioned himself for this killing shot had already committed his aircraft to a predetermined flight path and velocity. He fully expected his target to either maintain speed or desperately accelerate. A sudden, unexpected deceleration was entirely outside his established tactical framework and expectations. Marine Captain Jefferson de Blanc, an illustrious ace who achieved 9 aerial victories during the arduous Guadalcanal campaign, eloquently described teaching the throttle-down technique to newly arrived replacement pilots in early 1943. He instructed them to perceive it as a paradoxical game of chicken, played in reverse. The Zero pilot, filled with overconfidence, believes he has secured victory and is settling in for the kill. This very certainty makes him predictable. When the defending pilot abruptly chops the throttle, they are making a high-stakes wager that the enemy's kinetic energy and ingrained expectations will carry him past before he can adequately react. It is undeniably not a comfortable sensation. Speed plummets, controls become sluggish, and every primal instinct screams that a grave error is being committed. Yet, if executed with precise timing, it grants 1 or 2 precious seconds where the adversary is momentarily in front, and the defending pilot is still alive with a clear shot. However, the throttle-down maneuver possessed inherent limitations that aviators learned through the harsh realities of trial and error. It was fundamentally a singular, high-stakes gambit. Once executed, a pilot had bled off the vast majority of their airspeed and kinetic energy. If the opportunity presented by the enemy's overshoot was missed, the pilot found themselves in a dire predicament, slow, exposed, and devoid of any energy reserves for further evasion or engagement. Furthermore, it proved largely ineffective against multiple adversaries. While one Zero might be forced to overshoot, its wingman would simply adjust their attack, capitalizing on the defending pilot's vulnerable, low-speed recovery phase. The momentous Battle of Midway in June 1942 had already ratified the efficacy of Thach's weave under demanding combat conditions. However, it was Guadalcanal that became the definitive arena where energy tactics and sophisticated throttle management transformed from nascent experiments into entrenched combat doctrine. Henderson Field, captured by the Marines on August 7, 1942, sat at the epicenter of a brutal 6-month meat grinder that pilots grimly referred to as the slot. Japanese aircraft launched from Rabaul almost daily, and American fighters scrambled from Henderson's muddy, shell-pocked runway to intercept them. This was the arduous proving ground where theoretical principles were relentlessly, violently, and unforgivingly confronted by the stark realities of aerial warfare. Marine Fighting Squadron 223, under the capable leadership of Major John L. Smith, arrived at Henderson on August 20, 1942, bringing with them 19 Wildcats. Smith's pilots had been thoroughly imbued with the fundamental principles of energy fighting long before their deployment to Guadalcanal, strictly eschewing turning engagements with Zeros. Instead, maintaining altitude advantage, executing swift diving attacks, delivering precise firing passes, and rapidly climbing back to altitude. On August 24th, during the pivotal Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Smith's squadron intercepted a formidable Japanese formation of bombers and their Zero escorts. The Marines maintained their superior altitude, plunging through the Zero screen at over 350 miles per hour, destroying 4 bombers in their decisive initial pass, and then rapidly regaining altitude before the Zeros could effectively respond. The surviving Zero pilots turned and twisted ineffectually below, showcasing their renowned maneuverability to an unengaged void, while Smith's pilots calmly set up for another devastating diving attack. The engagement statistics from those initial weeks at Guadalcanal told a truly remarkable story. In August 1942, Marine and Navy fighters operating from Henderson Field successfully shot down 42 Japanese aircraft while sustaining losses of only 16 of their own, yielding an impressive ratio of approximately 2.6 to 1. In stark contrast, the fighting witnessed in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies just 6 months prior had frequently seen ratios that predominantly favored the Japanese. The significant disparity in performance was not attributable to superior aircraft. The Wildcats at Guadalcanal were the very same models that had struggled earlier in the conflict. The crucial difference lay entirely in the tactics employed. American pilots were no longer fighting the way the Zero's design inherently wanted them to fight. Captain Marion Carl, who earned the distinction of becoming the inaugural Marine Corps ace at Guadalcanal, vividly recounted a typical engagement on September 9, 1942, which perfectly epitomized how throttle management had become seamlessly integrated into standard combat procedure. Carl had ambushed a Zero from a superior position, made his firing pass, and was executing a climb back to altitude when he noticed his speed had dropped more than intended. A second Zero had deftly maneuvered behind him during his ascent. Carl deliberately continued his climb for another 3 seconds, observing his airspeed indicator steadily drop from 210 to 180 knots, intentionally allowing the Zero to further reduce the separation. Then, with decisive precision, he simultaneously reduced his throttle to idle and deployed his landing flaps, a dual deceleration that precipitously killed his airspeed. The Zero overshot so violently that it passed nearly 100 feet ahead of Carl's nose. Carl swiftly retracted his flaps, shoved his throttle forward, and destroyed the Zero with a lethal deflection shot as it desperately attempted to dive away. It is important to acknowledge that the Japanese naval aviators were neither unintelligent nor inflexible in their approach. They perceptively discerned the shift in American combat methodologies and actively endeavored to counteract them. By October 1942, Japanese fighter pilots operating over Guadalcanal began maintaining elevated positions and engaging with increased circumspection. Some even emulated slashing attacks, mirroring the American boom and zoom tactics. However, they grappled with a fundamental architectural paradox. The Zero's design was optimally configured for exceptional turning performance at moderate velocities. When Zero pilots attempted to engage in energy battles at high speed and high altitude, they inadvertently relinquished the inherent advantages their aircraft provided without acquiring commensurate benefits. A Zero attempting to execute a boom and zoom maneuver demonstrated negligible efficacy at best, whereas a Wildcat employing energy tactics was, conversely, capitalizing fully on its intrinsic capabilities. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought between November 12th and 13th in 1942, served as a dramatic and unequivocal testament to the profound evolution in American fighter tactics over a mere half-year. During this pivotal engagement, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley spearheaded a combat air patrol comprising 8 Wildcats as a formidable Japanese strike formation bore down upon the American fleet. Rather than impulsively engaging the approaching enemy head-on, Flatley ingeniously positioned his division a strategic 5,000 feet above the Japanese array and slightly to its flank, thereby securing a decisive advantage in both altitude and potential energy. His skilled aviators executed a series of relentless diving assaults on the bomber formation, with each Wildcat completing 3 or 4 distinct boom and zoom maneuvers. The Japanese Zero escorts, in their attempts to intercede, found themselves perpetually reacting to the American onslaught, unable to dictate the terms of the engagement. Flatley's squadron achieved a resounding victory, accounting for 7 bombers and 2 Zeros without incurring any losses to their own aircraft. As the year 1942 drew to a close, the marked improvement in American kill ratios became even more strikingly evident. Throughout November and December, American fighter pilots operating in the Solomons consistently achieved impressive rates, nearing 4-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. Compelling evidence gleaned from captured Japanese documents and the interrogations of prisoners of war unveiled a burgeoning respect, tinged with apprehension, for the refined American fighter tactics. One Japanese naval aviator, downed and subsequently apprehended in December 1942, disclosed to his interrogators that Zero pilots had received explicit instructions to eschew protracted engagements with American fighters that managed to sustain an altitude advantage, pointedly observing that the Americans no longer fight foolishly. Henderson Field, by necessity, transformed into an informal crucible of tactical innovation, a vibrant laboratory where successful methodologies disseminated rapidly through direct, invaluable pilot-to-pilot instruction. Seasoned combat veterans would routinely take newly arrived aviators aside, meticulously elucidating the precise execution of throttle-down overshoots, the nuanced art of assessing energy states, and the critical skill of discerning when a Zero pilot had fully committed to an attack pattern. This vital knowledge, at this stage, had not yet been codified into formal doctrine. Indeed, the training manuals back in the United States largely continued to espouse traditional dogfighting techniques. However, in the unforgiving theater of the South Pacific, a fundamentally new approach to aerial combat was being forged through sheer imperative and meticulously refined through the harsh crucible of survival. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. By the dawn of 1943, both the United States Navy and Marine Corps had recognized a peculiar challenge. It was, in essence, a good problem to have, yet a problem nonetheless. While experienced pilots in the Pacific had independently devised and perfected highly effective combat strategies against Japanese fighters, this invaluable reservoir of knowledge resided predominantly within the collective wisdom of combat veterans and was scattered across various after-action reports. In stark contrast, new pilots arriving directly from stateside training facilities were still being rigorously instructed in the outdated art of dogfighting, emphasizing turning maneuvers with the enemy, and relying heavily on individual aerial combat prowess. The pressing need was clear. The Navy had to systematically institutionalize the hard-won lessons learned in the bloody skies over Guadalcanal, transforming these battlefield innovations into a coherent and systematic training doctrine. The Naval Air Station at Jacksonville, Florida, was destined to become the veritable epicenter of this profound tactical revolution in fighter pilot instruction. In February 1943, Commander John Thatch himself received orders to return from the Pacific Front, with the express mandate to completely redesign the fighter training curriculum. Thatch arrived laden with reams of invaluable combat data, compelling gun camera footage, and detailed debriefing transcripts. More significantly, he brought with him an even more invaluable asset, the undeniable credibility of a combat commander, who had not only devised tactics that demonstrably worked, but had also kept his pilots alive in the crucible of battle. When Commander Thatch spoke, the instructors listened with rapt attention. When he unequivocally declared that traditional dogfighting training was inadvertently costing pilots their lives, the Navy promptly initiated a fundamental overhaul in how it approached and taught fighter combat. The revamped curriculum implemented at Jacksonville and other critical training bases heralded a complete philosophical paradigm shift. Student pilots were now meticulously instructed in energy management principles even before they delved into the intricacies of aerobatics. Instructors ingeniously utilized classroom physics demonstrations to vividly illustrate complex kinetic and potential energy concepts. A particularly efficacious teaching method involved rolling balls down ramps of varying heights. Students could viscerally observe how a ball commencing its descent from a higher elevation, possessing greater potential energy, would strike with more force and traverse a greater distance, demonstrating more kinetic energy than one starting from a lower point. The core message was distilled into a simple, unforgettable truth. Altitude equates to energy, and energy ultimately equates to life. The pilot who commences an engagement from a superior altitude inherently controls the flow of the fight. Throttle discipline, a technique of paramount importance, was elevated to a specific, dedicated training module. Student pilots engaged in rigorous practice engagements where instructors, flying faster aircraft, would deliberately position themselves on their tail, meticulously simulating a zero attack. The students were then compelled to execute precise throttle-down maneuvers while simultaneously maintaining impeccable aircraft control, timing their deceleration with pinpoint accuracy to force the pursuing instructor into an overshoot. Following this, they had to recover with sufficient alacrity to convert their defensive posture into an offensive advantage. This training was, by all accounts, intensely nerve-wracking. The act of deliberately reducing throttle with an instructor glued to one's tail felt inherently suicidal. Yet it was precisely this counterintuitive practice that meticulously built the crucial muscle memory and unwavering confidence required to execute the technique flawlessly under the immense pressures of actual combat. Instructors consistently noted that students who demonstrated mastery of throttle management during training exhibited significantly superior survival rates during their initial 3 combat missions, a period universally recognized as the most vulnerable phase for inexperienced aviators. The Fighter Tactics Manual, formally published in May 1943, served as the definitive codification of the empirical wisdom that Pacific veterans had painstakingly unearthed. This seminal manual explicitly stipulated that pilots must actively avoid turning engagements with Japanese fighters. It meticulously provided specific recommendations for altitude and speed, tailored to a diverse array of tactical scenarios. Furthermore, it described the innovative thatch weave in intricate detail, complete with illuminating diagrams, illustrating precise crossing angles and optimal timing. Most significantly, it elucidated the fundamental why behind each tactic, not merely prescribing what to do, but delving into the underlying physics and psychology that rendered these techniques so profoundly effective. This was a truly revolutionary departure for military doctrine, which had traditionally limited itself to instructing soldiers on actions without providing extensive explanatory context. Beyond specific maneuvers, training also placed paramount emphasis on rapid recognition and decisive decision-making under duress. Students were rigorously trained to instantly identify aircraft silhouettes and to assess complex tactical situations within mere seconds. Critical questions needed to be processed faster than conscious thought. Is that enemy aircraft positioned above or below you? What is your relative speed? Do you possess an energy advantage? Can you disengage safely if the engagement takes an unfavorable turn? To instill these instinctive responses, instructors devised high-pressure scenarios during training flights, including simulated emergencies, encounters with multiple attackers, and low-fuel situations. These rigorous simulations forced students to make life-or-death decisions while simultaneously managing their aircraft's crucial energy state. The Marine Corps, recognizing the efficacy of this new doctrine, established an analogous training pipeline at Marine Corps Air Station El Centro, nestled within California's Imperial Valley. Marine instructors, many of whom were hardened Guadalcanal veterans, infused an even more aggressive edge into the burgeoning energy fighting doctrine. They vehemently stressed that maintaining altitude discipline demanded an almost painful level of patience. New pilots, often eager and impulsive, frequently desired to dive precipitously on every target they observed, thereby squandering their invaluable energy advantage for a low-probability shot. The seasoned veterans, however, meticulously taught them the art of waiting, of stalking their prey, and of positioning themselves with such unerring precision that the enemy remained utterly unaware of the impending attack until bullets began to strike. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Indian Joe Bauer, a revered Medal of Honor recipient, and a distinguished Guadalcanal veteran, powerfully conveyed to his students, "The successful fighter pilot is patient, calculating, and ruthless. Gallantry is for movies. Efficiency is for survival." By the middle of 1943, every single fighter pilot graduating from Navy and Marine Corps training programs had been thoroughly and systematically indoctrinated in the principles of energy tactics and throttle management. They had practiced the thatch weave with such relentless repetition that they could execute it flawlessly even in a state of semi-consciousness. They had undergone forced overshoot drills until the act of reducing throttle in a defensive situation felt entirely natural rather than terrifying. Crucially, they had ingrained the fundamental understanding that their Wildcats, Corsairs, or Hellcats simply could not outturn a Zero, and consequently, they would never attempt such a futile maneuver. This rigorously standardized training provided an invaluable assurance to veteran squadron commanders in the Pacific. Replacement pilots arriving in the theater now possessed a fundamental and comprehensive understanding of how to effectively fight and, more importantly, how to survive. The tangible results unequivocally validated the significant investment in this new training paradigm. In the latter half of 1943, as a steady influx of fully trained pilots flooded into Pacific squadrons, American fighter-kill ratios against Japanese aircraft soared dramatically, climbing above 5-1 and continuing their upward trajectory. These impressive numbers were not solely the achievements of veteran aces. Rather, they were the collective accomplishments of average pilots meticulously applying the systematic tactics they had learned in training. The institutional knowledge that had, in early 1943, been confined to the select few combat veterans had, by year's end, become a standard competency across the entire American fighter force. The throttle lever, once merely a simple control for speed, had been profoundly transformed into a formidable tactical weapon that every American fighter pilot now knew precisely how to employ. The throttle-down overshoot technique and the broader energy fighting doctrine it so perfectly encapsulated represented something far more profound than just a collection of clever aerial tactics. They served as a powerful demonstration of how American military culture, when properly galvanized and motivated, possessed an inherent capacity to systematically analyze complex problems, adapt swiftly to the strengths of its adversaries, and develop innovative solutions at a pace significantly faster than those adversaries could counter-adapt. The Japanese had dedicated the entirety of the 1930s to perfecting the formidable Zero and meticulously training an elite cadre of naval aviators to ruthlessly exploit its capabilities. In stark contrast, Americans, within a mere 6 months in 1942, managed to decipher how to neutralize a decade's worth of Japanese investment, subsequently institutionalizing that critical knowledge across thousands of pilots. This remarkable American adaptability generated a compounding strategic advantage that extended far beyond the confines of individual dogfights. By late 1943, Japanese naval aviation found itself ensnared in a deleterious spiral, a truly vicious cycle. Their most experienced pilots, the very veterans who had dominated the early stages of the war, were largely dead, having been shot down by American aviators who had learned not to engage on Japanese terms. Replacement pilots received severely abbreviated training due to Japan's critical shortages of fuel, time, and secure airspace necessary to properly develop aviators. These inexperienced pilots flew the very same Zeros that had terrorized the Pacific in 1942. But crucially, they lacked both veteran leadership and faced American pilots who had been systematically trained in tactics specifically engineered to exploit the Zero's fundamental weaknesses. The aircraft themselves had not undergone significant changes. However, the quality of the pilots flying them had precipitously collapsed. The collapse of previous aerial dominance, particularly for those operating Japanese aircraft, was dramatically underscored by the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, an epic encounter on June 19th to 20th, 1944. This pivotal confrontation, part of the larger Battle of the Philippine Sea, saw American carrier-borne fighters, primarily the formidable F-6F Hellcats, which masterfully blended the Wildcat's renowned durability with substantially enhanced performance capabilities, intercept vast formations of incoming Japanese strike aircraft. The American aviators meticulously adhered to strict altitude discipline, expertly applied energy tactics, and judiciously managed their engine throttles as tactical situations demanded. Over the course of just 2 days, the Japanese forces suffered catastrophic losses, approximately 600 aircraft, while American casualties amounted to roughly 120, with the vast majority of these attributable to operational mishaps rather than direct combat engagements. This astonishing disparity resulted in a kill ratio exceeding 10-1, a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never truly recover. The Mitsubishi Zero itself had not inherently become an antiquated design. Rather, the sophisticated and widely disseminated tactics engineered to effectively counter its advantages had become universally adopted by American forces. This profound intellectual framework, which gave birth to the innovative throttle-down tactics, extended its influence far beyond the confines of fighter aviation, permeating various aspects of American military thought. The very same rigorous analytical methodology, involving a meticulous examination of the adversary's inherent strengths, a precise identification of the underlying assumptions upon which those strengths were predicated, and the subsequent development of ingenious tactics designed to invalidate those core assumptions, manifested itself across numerous operational domains. For instance, submarine commanders painstakingly studied extant Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, and through this analysis devised novel tactics specifically engineered to exploit its inherent vulnerabilities and gaps. Similarly, bomber formations meticulously dissected enemy fighter attack patterns, leading to significant modifications in their defensive arrangements and strategies. The military, in essence, transformed into a dynamic learning organization, one that no longer perceived enemy capabilities as immutable, insurmountable obstacles, but rather as complex problems ripe for systematic analysis and innovative tactical resolution. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this transformation was how the seemingly counterintuitive throttle technique vividly illustrated that success in warfare often accrues to those willing to question deeply entrenched assumptions and bravely challenge conventional wisdom. Traditional fighter doctrine, for generations, dictated that aerial combat was primarily won through aggressive turning and intricate maneuvering. Every innate human instinct screamed that when an adversary was hot on one's tail, the only sensible course of action was to accelerate, not decelerate. The radical notion of deliberately reducing airspeed with an enemy fighter pursuing seemed utterly preposterous, bordering on suicidal. Until a cadre of pilots, driven by desperation or blessed with an uncommon streak of creativity, dared to experiment, discovering that such insanity could, paradoxically, yield superior results to conventional sanity. The mental exercises of Jimmy Thash, pushing matchsticks across his desk to simulate aerial maneuvers, Marion Carl's decisive act of chopping his throttle with a zero, dangerously close behind him, John Smith's rigorous drilling of his pilots to eschew turning in certain situations. These were not merely random acts of martial genius. They represented profound acts of intellectual courage, a resolute willingness to embrace radically different approaches when established. Conventional methods were consistently leading to devastating losses and mounting casualties. The Japanese, conspicuously, proved incapable of developing an equivalent adaptive capacity throughout the protracted Pacific War. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of the video to grasp the full scope of this remarkable story. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Please also share a comment about where you are from and what you think about this fascinating video topic. The Zero remarkably endured largely unaltered in its fundamental design from 1942 through 1945, even as the continually evolving American tactics progressively rendered its once formidable advantages increasingly irrelevant. Japanese training doctrine, regrettably, remained rigidly committed to emphasizing individual pilot skill and aggressive engagement, a philosophy maintained even as their overall pilot quality plummeted catastrophically. In stark contrast, when American aviators mastered the crucial principles of throttle discipline and energy management, they systematically disseminated this vital knowledge throughout their ranks. Conversely, while some Japanese pilots did indeed develop effective techniques to counter American tactics, such hard-won knowledge rarely managed to propagate beyond their immediate individual units. The very organizational culture that had initially fostered the Zero's extraordinary excellence ultimately proved unable to adapt when that excellence alone became insufficient to secure victory. The profound tactical evolution, which originated with American pilots desperately striving to survive their deadly encounters with Zeros, established enduring patterns that would fundamentally define American air combat doctrine not only through the nascent jet age, but far into subsequent eras. Pilots, flying F-86 Sabres against the formidable MiG-15s during the Korean War, for instance, directly employed energy tactics and precise throttle management techniques meticulously derived from their World War II experiences. Later, during the Vietnam War, a generation of fighter pilots who had regrettably forgotten these critical lessons and attempted to engage agile MiG-17s in turn fights with their heavier F-4 Phantoms were forced to relearn them through painful losses. This painful re-education directly led to the establishment of seminal programs like Top Gun and other advanced fighter training initiatives, which unequivocally re-emphasized the core energy fighting principles first developed over battlefields like Guadalcanal. Even today, modern fighter pilots continue to receive comprehensive instruction on energy states, overshoot mechanics, and the paramount importance of controlling engagement geometry, concepts that would be instantly recognizable and profoundly understood by pioneering figures such as Jimmy Thatch or Marion Carl. The humble throttle lever itself, a ubiquitous and seemingly mundane mechanical control present in every cockpit and manipulated dozens of times per flight, ultimately transcended its simple function to become a potent symbol of this larger, transformative shift in aerial warfare. For years, no one conceived of it as a weapon, until dire circumstances compelled an urgent need for creative solutions. This encapsulates the essential lesson: the fundamental tools required to resolve complex problems frequently already exist within our grasp. What is truly demanded is the visionary insight to perceive familiar objects in novel, unconventional ways, the profound courage to embark upon unorthodox approaches, and the unwavering discipline to systematically teach and embed those methods that prove effective. American fighter pilots in 1942 did not passively await the arrival of superior aircraft to overcome the daunting challenge posed by the Zero. Instead, they ingeniously utilized the aircraft they possessed, harnessed the immutable laws of physics governing all flight, and tapped into the extraordinary creativity that desperation often unlocks. They courageously pulled the throttle back, precisely when every instinct clamored for them to push it forward. In doing so, they dramatically reversed the roles, transforming the hunters into the hunted, rendering Japan's most formidable aerial weapon into an obsolete relic, and irrefutably demonstrating that adaptation invariably triumphs over perfection when that perfection lacks the capacity to evolve. The Zero pilots who, with unwavering confidence, committed to pursuit, fully expecting yet another effortless victory, instead found themselves catastrophically overshooting their intended targets, suddenly and fatally vulnerable in the final, fleeting seconds of their existence. The throttle, in its profound simplicity, had delivered its decisive verdict.